So we have incorporated some of the principles of universal design for learning into our fully online courses. So the slides here are taken from 2 of our radiology modules, and we feel that universal design for learning will be really beneficial in this area because it helps to overcome some of the barriers that are met in online education. So what universal design for learning is a kind of set of principles that aims to enhance learning for all learners. So it's really about providing options and variety in the way that you present content, in the way that students get to interact with the content, and the way that they engage with each other. So under these 3 principles, there's different sets of guidelines. So we're going to look at some of those now. And the reason that it can be beneficial in online is because a lot of the time online learners can feel that they're kind of learning in a vacuum. Attrition rates can be really high. Because of the very nature of online, you have quite a diverse or more diverse group of learners, and students who do very well in a classroom setting can struggle in an online learning environment. And the opposite is also true. So incorporating guidelines that enhance learning for all learners is particularly beneficial here. So some of the guidelines we're going to look at are around guiding the learner through the content, giving them opportunities to monitor their progress, to get feedback, and really about making the learning more memorable and more transferable. So one of the ways that we would do this is through the use of visuals. So for example, on this slide, we would have had audio and a transcript that describe the process of image sampling, so creating a digital copy of an analog image. And rather than just have the audio or maybe more text on screen, using a visual that encaptures this kind of concept really helps the learning to stick in the learner's head. And video is really useful here as well, so especially if we're looking at a process. So we all know that if you're learning a process, it's easier if you're shown rather than just told. So this is part of the process of hemostasis, and you can imagine that even if we use still images here, it could be quite difficult to understand, but the use of video kind of promotes the understanding across languages and across different learning styles. Another thing that we want to do in online particularly is to highlight the critical information. So it's difficult for learners to figure out what's most important for them to know. So we try and use graphs and diagrams, and we time those with the audio to really kind of emphasize those key points. And we want to kind of emphasize the big ideas that are being discussed as well. So another way to do this is with a process slide. And this is particularly useful if you don't have a lot of images. So here, for example, we only had 1 image and we had a big block of text. But rather than show all of the text at once, which would be kind of difficult for the learner to digest, we get them to walk through the steps of the process and kind of emphasize each stage in this sequence. And again, it just helps to make it more memorable. We also want to connect the relationships between information. So if you have 2 subtopics, rather than present them side by side, we find that using buttons and layers that bring up information can again help to just reinforce those connections. So here we actively get the learner to click on employee responsibilities and then employer responsibilities, and it emphasises the comparison between those 2. We also want to guide the learner as easily as possible. So what we do is we break the lecture into smaller parts. We lay it out clearly. We have consistent icons used throughout, and if learner input is required, we have a marker that kind of flashes to get their attention, and they can click for further instruction there. We also include a notes PDF, so this is particularly good for learners who might want something tangible to follow along with the online. It helps them to organise their resources. There's a space for notes and a visual cue of each slide. And we also include resources. So if, say, a policy document or a form was mentioned in the lecture, we'd include it there so that they can download it and go through it in more detail in their own time. We also use branching to guide the learner. So here we have 4 buttons, and that gives an overview of everything that we'll cover in this section of the lecture. They'll click on the first section and go through that, and when they've completed that, they'll be brought back to the main page. The first button is greyed out because they've covered that section, and the next button has been made active. So we're guiding them in a particular order, but giving them an overview of everything. Another way to do this is to break down the information into smaller elements within the sections by using a tabbed slide. So if you, say, had 4 subtopics, again, rather than present them one after the other, grouping them in a tabbed slide under particular headings, kind of just segments that distinguishes each section of the lecture and reinforces the headings the student should kind of be keeping in mind. So we also want to maximise the generalisation and the transfer of the information. So here, for example, we have a formative drag and drop. They have unlimited attempts to drag these symptoms into the correct envelope, and the very activity of doing that helps them to kind of reinforce that information, helps them to remember it again. We also want to activate prior knowledge. So our students would have learned the inverse square law as one of the basics of radiology. And this slide kind of puts that into action. So they can pick up the radiologist and drag them to different distances from the patient. And when they do that, they see how much radiation is absorbed depending on how far away you stand from the patient. We also then want to give them opportunities to review their progress. So here they click on the tiles, they see how much radiation is absorbed depending on each radiology exam, and there's an audio description as well. But if they want to, they can then turn the audio off and use this slide to test their recall and monitor whether they're really taking in the information. So this is really important to kind of enhance their capacity to monitor their own progress. It's particularly, like I say, online, you can feel like you're in a vacuum, you're not really sure if you're taking in everything. So we use a range of quiz types. Different quiz types will suit different learners and different learning styles. So we have a kind of a labelling, matching pairs, drag and drop, scenario-based questions, and so on. So we want the feedback to be timely and frequent so that they really feel that they're engaging with the content. We also want an element of communication, so it wasn't feasible for us to include a forum, which would be ideal, but we did include some live online tutorials, so that was a chance for synchronous feedback with the academic and connection with each other as well. And we got positive feedback about that learners felt, there's other learners here on this course, I'm not learning on my own. In terms of the feedback, we had small numbers, but we did get positive feedback that kind of reinforced the inclusion of these principles of universal design, particularly in terms of chunking the lecture into smaller pieces, including the interactivity and inclusion of the online tutorials. So things to consider if you were looking at doing this, if you're using Storyline particularly, it can be labour intensive to create these templates, but once they're created, it's easy to switch out elements and use them for different modules. And we do feel that the inclusion of universal design helps to overcome some of these barriers that are present in online learning environments and ultimately, hopefully, would reduce attrition as well. So that's it if you have any questions.